the third week of her service at Thornholt on a March morning when the rain had not stopped since Tuesday. Clara Weston was told to carry a basin of cooled water up the east stairs and not to speak unless spoken to. She carried it. The basin was pewter and heavier than it looked, and the water shifted against the rim at every step, and she counted the steps because counting kept her hands steady. 22 to the landing. 9 more to the sick-room door. The boy inside was 7 years old and had been coughing for 11 days. She had been hired as a nurse because the physician from Marlow had refused to sleep in the house, and because the housekeeper had run out of women willing to sit in a room where a child might die. Clara had been willing. Clara had been willing for reasons she did not intend to explain to anyone at Thornholt, and certainly not to the man who stood at the sick-room window with his back to the door, one hand flat against the glass, watching the rain come down over the park as though he could argue with it. She knew the shape of his shoulders before she knew his name. "Set it down," he said without turning. "Then go." His voice was low and level and gave nothing away, and it went through her like cold water down a wrist. She set the basin on the washstand. She did not go. She looked instead at the child in the bed, at the flush along his cheekbones and the way his breath caught at the top of every inhalation, and she said quietly, "He is too warm under that counterpane, Your Grace." The hand on the glass did not move. The rain kept on. "The physician instructed that he be kept warm," he said. "The physician is in Marlow," Clara said. Then he turned. She had 8 years to prepare for that turning, and she had prepared for none of it. Eleanor Vance, the housekeeper, had said the Duke of Ashcombe was a cold man, and the scullery girls had said he was a hard one, and the coachman had said he had not laughed since the year the old Duchess died. And every one of them had been describing stranger. Clara was not looking at a stranger. She was looking at a man who had once handed her a coin in the rain outside a coaching inn at Rothcaster, and had ridden away before she could return it, and she had been 16 years old, and she had been standing in the road with nothing at all. He looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds. Then he looked at the counterpane. "Take it off him," he said, and walked out. Her hands were shaking when she folded it back. She told herself it was the weight of the basin. Stay with her a moment. What she did not yet know was that the thing she had carried in her pocket for 8 years was about to become the most dangerous object in the county. Clara Weston was 24 years old, and had been at various times a farmer's daughter, an orphan, a charity scholar, a village schoolmistress, and now a nurse in a house that did not want her. Her father had died of a fever in the spring of her 16th year, and her mother had followed him inside a month, and the freehold he had rented had gone back to its owner with the promptness the law allows, and Clara had walked out of Rothcaster with a bundle and no destination on an afternoon when the rain came sideways off the fells. She had stood outside the White Hart for an hour. She remembered the hour precisely. She remembered that the water had gone through her boots first, and then her stockings, and then had found the seam of her cloak at the shoulder, and that she had understood with a kind of calm that she could not go into the inn because she had nothing to pay with, and could not stay outside it because she would be moved along. And that there was no third thing. A carriage had stopped. A young man had come out of it very tall, hatless, already wet, and had asked her whether she was waiting for someone. She had said no. He had asked whether she had anywhere to go. She had said no again, and had been ashamed of the plainness of it. He had put something into her hand and folded her fingers over it, and the metal had been warm from his pocket, and he had said, "Go inside. Ask for a room. Say the account will be settled." Then a woman's voice from inside the carriage had said his name sharp with impatience, and he had gone, and the carriage had gone, and Clara had stood in the road with her hand closed around what he had given her. It had not been a coin. 8 years later, in a house she had entered through the kitchen door, Clara sat beside a sleeping child at 2 in the morning and took the locket out of her pocket and turned it over in the candlelight, and the crest on the back was the same crest that was carved into the stone above Thornholt's entrance hall. Worn smooth by weather at the gate and sharp as the day, it was struck in her palm. She had never opened it. She had told herself for 8 years that this was delicacy. Sitting in that sick room with the boy's breath rasping and the rain still coming, she admitted the truth of it. She had not opened it because as long as it stayed shut, it remained the thing a stranger had given her, and once opened it would become the thing she had kept. She put it back in her pocket. The boy coughed. She lifted him against her shoulder and held him through it. And when it passed, she wiped his mouth and laid him down and did not sleep. The house had already decided what she was. "The charity nurse," Eleanor Vance said 3 days later to the under-housekeeper in the linen passage, not quietly enough. "The charity nurse may sit up with him tonight. She has nowhere else to be." Clara heard it through an open door, with a stack of clean sheets in her arms. The under-housekeeper laughed the way people laugh, when they are not sure whether they are permitted. Clara went on down the passage and set the sheets in the press, and closed the press door with more care than it needed. Her face was hot. Her hands were entirely steady. This was the arrangement she had made with herself years ago, and it had held so far. The boy was called Henry. He was the Duke's ward, not his son, which the servant said in a tone suggesting they had views on the difference. He liked to be read to. He liked the word peculiar, and used it whenever he could manage it. He owned a wooden horse with one ear gone and would not have it mended, on the grounds that a horse with one ear was more interesting than a horse with two, and Clara found she agreed with him, and told him so, and he was pleased for the rest of the afternoon. She learned his fever, the way she had learned everything worth knowing, which was by watching. It came up at 4 in the afternoon, and again at 2 in the morning, and it broke both times toward dawn. And on the 4th day she began writing the hours on the back of a laundry list with a stub of pencil, because the physician from Marlow, who came on Tuesdays, had asked her twice, and both times she had been made to guess. She did not intend to guess about a child. When he came the following Tuesday, she handed him the laundry list without a word, and watched him read it, and watched him decide visibly that he had underestimated something. And he changed the dose of the mixture and said nothing to her at all about who had made him do it. By the 5th day his fever had broken, and by the 7th he was sitting up, demanding to know whether owls were peculiar, and Clara said that they were the most peculiar of birds because they could turn their heads nearly all the way round. And Henry attempted this and fell over sideways, laughing, and from the doorway a man's voice said, "Do not let him do that." She had not heard him come. She never heard him come. "No, your grace," she said. "Miss Weston." He was in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and he did not step in. "The physician says he may go down to the library tomorrow." "He may not," Clara said. There was a pause, with weather in it. "You contradict the physician a great deal," the Duke said. "He has been coughing for 15 days, Clara said. 3 more days of the same room and the same fire will cost you nothing. The library is at the north end. The corridor between is 30 feet of stone, and the wind comes under that door from the terrace." Another pause. Something moved in his jaw and was disciplined out of existence. 3 days, he said. "Sit down, Miss Weston. You have been standing since 5. He was gone before she could answer. She sat down because her knees had already decided to. She looked at the chair and at the door and at Henry, who was watching her with frank interest. "He does that," Henry said. "He tells people to sit down." The Duke of Ashcombe was 34 years old and had held the title for 6 years. Clara learned what the house was willing to tell her, which was a great deal, because servants talk and because nobody troubles to be careful in front of a charity nurse. He had a brother once, dead these 7 years. He had a cousin, Mr. Robert Lyle, who came often and stayed long, and had opinions about the estate. He had an aunt, the Dowager Lady Ferrers, who was arriving at the end of the month with the intention of settling his marriage, and a young lady already selected, a Miss Georgiana Halstead, whose father owned 4,000 acres adjoining Thornholt's western boundary, and whose portrait had already been hung, briefly, and then removed. 1. The yellow drawing room. And he did not go into the west wing. Nobody went into the west wing. The doors were locked, and the housekeeper had the key, and no one asked why. Clara did not ask why. She had her own locked thing, and she carried it in her pocket, and it grew heavier every day she stayed. She saw the West Wing doors once a day, at least. They were at the head of the long corridor on the second floor, and she passed them carrying trays and basins and folded linen, and they were oak, and they were shut, and there was a brass plate around the keyhole that somebody polished, which was the detail that stayed with her. Somebody was still polishing the lock of a room nobody entered. She thought about that more than she should have. A house that gives up on a room lets the brass go green. Thornhout was keeping that door ready. She should have left. She was clear-eyed about this even at the time. The child was mending. Her wages were paid weekly, and the sensible course was to take her quarter's money at the end of the month and go to Marlow and find a household where the master had never handed her anything in the rain. She had a reference. She had a plan. She stayed. The dowager arrived on the 29th of March in a traveling coach with a maid and a footman and 11 pieces of luggage. And the yellow drawing room was opened, and Miss Halstead arrived the following afternoon with her mother, and Thornhout filled up with the particular noise a house makes when it is being inspected. Clara met the Dowager Lady Ferrers on the second-floor landing while carrying a tray. She stood aside as she had been taught. The Dowager stopped anyway, and looked at her the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been moved without permission. "You are the nurse?" "Yes, my lady." "How long has the boy been ill?" 19 days, my lady. He is nearly well." 19 days, the Dowager's fan came up a half-inch and stopped. And in 19 days, nobody thought to send for a proper woman from London. She said it past Clara, to the corridor, to the house, to the county, a charity nurse. In my brother's house, the tray did not move. Clara had learned to hold a tray. "Will that be all, my lady?" The Dowager went by her without answering, and the maid went by after, and the footman after that, and Clara stood on the landing for a moment, and then carried the tray down to the kitchen and set it on the table and put both hands flat on the wood. That was twice. She counted these things. She had not intended to. The counting had simply begun. The next evening the Duke came to the nursery at an hour when he had no business being there. Henry was asleep. Clara was mending a stocking by one candle because the light was better than nothing, and because her hands wanted work. "Miss Weston," she stood. He gestured her down again, and she sat, and he did not sit, and for a while he simply stood at the foot of the small bed, and looked at the sleeping child with an expression she could not read because his face had been built not to be read. "He asked for you at 4 o'clock this morning," he said. "The maid told me. Not for me. For you. He is 7, Your Grace. He asks for whoever is nearest. You were not nearest. You were 3 floors down, asleep in a room without a fire." His voice did not change. "That has been corrected. You will have the green room at the end of this passage from tomorrow." Clara's needle stopped. "Your Grace, the green room is a family room. It is a room with a fire," he said, "and it is 9 feet from the boy. Eat something, Miss Weston. Vance says you have not been down to the hall at dinner in a week." She looked up at him, and he was already looking at the window. The rain had come back. It had a way of coming back in that part of the county, and she had begun to notice that he stood at windows during it always, with a stillness that had nothing restful in it. "I dine in the kitchen," she said. "The hall is not for me." "The hall," he said, "is for whom I say it is for." And then he left because he always left. And Clara sat in a cold nursery with the stocking in her lap and her heart going like something trapped, and she was furious with herself, and it did not help. Her mother had told her once, in the last week, in a voice already gone thin, that a woman who has nothing must be careful what she permits herself to want. Clara had been 15. She had not understood it then as instruction. She understood it now. She wanted. That was the plain fact of it, sitting in that chair at 10 at night, with the rain on the glass. Not the room, not the fire, not the wages. Him. The particular way he stood in a doorway and would not come in. The 3 seconds he had looked at her the first morning. She wanted him to look at her again, and she had no right to it, and no prospect of it, and no name for it that she was willing to say even inside her own head. and she sat there and let herself know it for exactly as long as it took the candle to gut her, and then she snuffed it and went to bed. On the 2nd of April, the West Wing was unlocked, because Miss Halstead wished to see the long gallery. Clara was not in the party. Clara was in the corridor outside it, taking Henry to the schoolroom, and the doors were standing open, and the dust sheets were half off, and the dowager was saying something about light, and Henry pulled at her hand and said, "That is where the pictures are." And before she could stop him, he had gone through. She followed. She had 30 seconds inside that gallery, and she used every one of them. There was a portrait at the far end turned to face the wall. There was a second portrait beside it, uncovered, of a young man in regimentals, dark-haired, very tall, with a mouth that had clearly been about to smile when the painter caught it. He was not the Duke. He was near enough to the Duke to make her stomach turn over. And around his painted throat, hanging plain against the red of his coat, was a locket she had carried in her pocket for 8 years. "Miss Weston." Eleanor Vance had her by the elbow. "The nursery party is not in this wing." She got Henry out. She got herself out. She got down the corridor, and around the corner and into the schoolroom, and set Henry at his slate, and stood at the window with her back to him and her hand pressed flat against her own pocket, and the shape of it burned through her glove. Not his. Never his. She had been given, in the rain, at 16, by a man who did not stop to think about it, a thing that belonged to a dead brother. She got the story in pieces over the following week. The way one gets anything in a house like that, a sentence from Eleanor Vance, with her back turned at the linen press. A half thing from the coachman who had driven the family for 19 years, and who said only that there had been a night in January when the study door had been shut for 2 hours, and that he had been told to have the chaise ready at 6 the next morning, and had not been told why. A remark from the second footman, who had not been in the house then, and was repeating what he had been told, which Clara discounted, and then found she could not discount, because it agreed with the rest. The old Duke's second son had been called Edmund. He had gone into the army against his father's wishes, at 19. He had come home once in the winter of the year Clara's father died, and there had been a quarrel of some kind, and he had gone back, and he had been killed in the spring, and his body had not come home at all. The current Duke had been the one to say the words that sent him back. That was the part the servants only half knew and half guessed at, and Clara did not learn it from them. She learned it, because on the 11th of April at 1 in the morning, she went down for water and found the library door open and a lamp burning, and the Duke of Ashcombe sitting at a table with his coat off and his head in his hands. She should have gone. She turned to go. "Miss Weston." She stopped in the doorway. He had not lifted his head. "I am told you sat with him 19 nights, he said. "Vance says you did not ask for extra wages. Why?" "Because he was frightened, Your Grace. That is not a reason. That is a description." Now he did look up, and the lamp was low and his face was not built for that light, and everything the discipline had been holding was visible in it, and she saw that he had not slept in some days. "Everyone in this house wants something from me. The Dowager wants the Halstead land. Lyle wants the tenancies. Halstead wants a duchess in the family. You sit up 19 nights with a child who is not yours, and you ask for nothing, and I cannot make it come out." "Perhaps I am peculiar," Clara said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It lasted less than a second, and it was the first she had ever seen of it, and it undid her more thoroughly than any kindness could have. He stood. He came around the table. He stopped 4 feet from her, which was 3 feet nearer than he had ever been, and she could smell rain on his shirt and the smoke of the lamp, and she did not step back, and neither of them said anything at all for long enough that the fire dropped a log. "My brother's name was Edmund," he said. "He said it once. He did not say it again in her hearing that night or any night. He asked me for money in the January of the year he died. £300. He had debts, and he had a woman in Lisbon he intended to marry, and my father was dead 6 months. And I had been the Duke of Ashcombe for about as long as it takes to learn where the plate is kept, and I refused him. Not because of the £300, because I was frightened of being wrong. And refusing looked more like a duke than agreeing did. He was very still. He went back in March. He was dead in May. I have spent 7 years being certain of things, in order to avoid being certain of that one. The fire dropped again. Clara stood in the doorway with her hand in her pocket and her fingers closed around the locket, and could not make her mouth open. "Go to bed, Miss Weston," he said, and turned away. And that was the whole of it. She went up. She sat on the edge of the bed in the green room with the door shut and the locket in her open palm, and she thought about the woman in Lisbon, and about a young man in regimentals with a mouth about to smile, and about a boy of 7 with dark hair and no parents who had been brought to Thornholt 6 years ago and never explained to anyone. 6 years ago, she did the arithmetic 3 times, and it came out the same 3 times. Henry had come to Thornholt in the year the current Duke inherited, which was the year after Edmund died, and Henry was 7. And Henry had a mouth that went crooked at one corner when he was about to be pleased with himself. The house called him the Ward. The house had been calling him the Ward for 6 years, because the house had been given no other word to use, and Clara had been in the sick room 19 nights, with her hand on his chest counting his breathing, and had never once thought to ask why a man who had not laughed since his brother died had put a strange child 9 feet from his own bedchamber. She still did not open it. She was not being delicate any longer. She was being a coward, and she knew the difference, and she went to sleep anyway. If you have been holding your breath since the gallery, you may let it go now. She could not, yet. The engagement was announced at the dinner of the 18th of April before anyone had agreed to it. The Dowager did it beautifully. 26 at table in the great dining room, the candles doubled in the mirrors, the orchestra from Marlowe, tuning in the ballroom beyond, because there was to be dancing after, and between the fish and the game, the Dowager rose with her glass and spoke of 2 families, long neighbors, and of her nephew's happiness. And the table came to its feet, and Clara, standing against the wall behind Henry's chair, because Henry had been permitted down for the soup, and had refused to go up without her, watched the Duke of Ashcombe rise last of all, and say nothing whatever. He did not deny it. That was what she took upstairs, with her. He stood, and his glass was in his hand, and he did not deny it, and Miss Halstead's color was high and lovely, and she looked at him with the confidence of a woman who has been told her entire life that she is the correct answer. He had not looked at Clara once. The Dowager found her afterward in the passage behind the servants' screen, and she had been waiting there, which Clara understood only later. "Miss Weston?" A word. Clara stopped. "You will be leaving us on Friday," the Dowager said. "The boy is well. Vance has your wages made up to the quarter, and a character reference which I have read, and which is generous." The fan was down. She was not enjoying herself. That was the thing Clara had not expected. "I am not a cruel woman. I have watched you look at my nephew across 3 weeks of dinners you were not invited to, and I have watched him not look at you. And I am telling you plainly, because nobody else in this house will. There is no version of this in which you are anything but the charity nurse who was sent away in April. There it was. The 3rd time he is a duke," the Dowager said, more gently, which was worse. "He will marry land, or he will marry money, or he will marry a name. He will not marry a woman who came here through the kitchen with nothing in her pockets." Clara said, "I have something in my pocket." She had not meant to say it. It was out before she had built it. The Dowager's eyebrows rose a fraction. "I beg your pardon, nothing, my lady." "Friday, I understand." She went up. She got as far as the 2nd landing, and had to stop and hold the rail, and the ballroom music started below her 3 stories of stone away, and still perfectly audible. And she stood on a stone stair in a plain gray gown, while an orchestra played for a woman who owned 4,000 acres. She stood there a while. The music went on. Somebody below was laughing at the wrong time in the phrase, which meant they were not listening to it, which meant they were enjoying themselves, and she had a very clear picture of the room without needing to see it. The candles doubled in the mirrors, the terrace doors opened despite the cold, because 30 people generate their own weather. Miss Halstead's, ice blue silk going round in the figure and her mother watching from the wall, with the satisfaction of a woman whose long campaign is entering its final week. She was not, she found, weeping. She was doing arithmetic. She had 11 pounds. She had a reference. She had a locket that was not hers, that had never been hers, that she had carried out of Rothcaster because a boy in the rain had folded her fingers over it and ridden away before he could be told what he had done. She had told herself for 8 years that keeping it was accident. Standing on that stair, she understood that she had kept it because it was the only proof she had ever possessed that a person had once looked at her and seen someone worth stopping a carriage for, and that the proof was worth nothing to anybody but her, and that a dead man's mother, or a dead man's son, or a dead man's brother might reckon its worth differently. She had had it for 8 years, and had never once asked what it cost. The man she took it from, she did not sleep that night. She packed instead, which took under an hour and left 5 more, and she sat on the edge of the bed in a room she had been given 9 days ago, by a man who could not say a kind thing without disguising it as an order. And she looked at the fire he had put her 9 feet from a child for, and she thought about the arithmetic again and could not make it stop. Friday was the 22nd. On Thursday morning she went to the library and asked Eleanor Vance for 5 minutes of the Duke's time, and was told that the Duke was riding out to the western boundary with Mr. Lisle and Sir Thomas Halstead, and would not be back before the dinner, and that there was a dance in the evening, and the whole county coming, and that Miss Weston would do better to finish her packing. So she went to the dinner. She had thought about it for 6 hours, and she had not talked herself out of it, which she found interesting, because she had talked herself out of every other brave thing she had ever considered doing. She was not going down to be chosen. She was clear about that, with herself standing at the top of the servants' stair with her heart going. Nobody was going to choose her. She was going down because a thing in her pocket belonged to a dead man's brother, and she had kept it for 8 years without asking, and because if she got into a cart on Friday morning with it still against her ribs, she would be, for the rest of her life, a woman who had taken something. She had no gown. She had the gray one and a clean fichu, and her mother's plain gold ring on a ribbon at her throat, and she waited in the passage behind the screen until the covers had been drawn and the ladies had gone through, and the room was standing, and loud and full, and then she walked into the great dining room of Thornholt in front of 31 people. The room stopped in the way rooms do. Not all at once. In a wave from the near end to the far. The dowager rose halfway out of her chair. Miss Weston. Clara did not look at her. She looked down the length of the table at the Duke of Ashcombe, who had come to his feet without any expression at all, and she put her hand into her pocket and drew out the locket and held it up so that the candlelight took it. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice came out clear, which surprised her. "This belongs to your family. It was given to me at Rothcaster, outside the White Hart, on the 14th of October 8 years ago, by a man who did not stop long enough to hear me refuse it. I have kept it since. I should have returned it the first morning I understood whose house I was in, and I did not, and I am sorry for it. Nobody moved. I am told I came here with nothing in my pockets," Clara said. That was true. But it is true again in about a minute. She set it on the tablecloth, on the white damask, between the salt and the epergne, and she turned to go. "Clara!" She stopped, her given name in his voice, for the first time. He came down the length of that table, not quickly. 31 people watching, and a dead silence, and the Duke of Ashcombe walking the length of his own dining room in 7 strides, and he did not pick up the locket. He walked past it. He stopped in front of her, and he took her hand, the bare one, in front of his aunt and his cousin and Sir Thomas Halstead and Miss Halstead in her ice-blue silk, and he said this, "I gave it to her. I am marrying her." The silence held for the length of a breath. Then it broke, and it did not break the way the dowager needed it to. It broke at the far end of the table, where old Mr. Carow, who had known the old Duke 40 years, said well on a long exhalation, and it broke again beside him, where Lady Marchbanks set down her glass and said distinctly, "Rothcaster." That was the autumn Edmund went out. The dowager was on her feet, her hand was on the back of her chair, and her fan was on the floor and nobody had picked it up. Ashcombe, you cannot. The announcement is made. It is made. It was made at this table, before witnesses. It was quite properly. She stopped. She had heard herself. She looked at the locket lying on the damask between the salt and the epern, and she looked at Clara, and Clara watched the arithmetic run behind that face and come out where arithmetic always comes out for people who have been confident their whole lives. She had spoken at that table 2 nights ago. She had spoken for her nephew without her nephew. 31 people had just watched her discover that this had been a thing she was permitted to do only for as long as nobody said otherwise. "Aunt," the Duke said, and his voice was not unkind. "Sit down." She sat down. Miss Halstead did not fragment. That was to her credit, and Clara noted it even then. She looked at the locket for a long moment, and at the hand the Duke was holding, and something crossed her face that was not humiliation but recognition. And she picked up the dowager's fan from the floor and put it back on the table beside her and said to nobody in particular, "Papa, I should like the carriage at 10. Sir Thomas Halstead said. "Now, look here, Ashcombe." "Sir Thomas," said a voice from the door. "If I might." Mr. Penhale, the family solicitor, had been at the dinner because he was always at the dinners, and he came forward now with the unhurried air of a man who has been waiting 19 days for a document to become relevant. He had a folded paper. He had had it, Clara learned later, since the 11th of April, which was the morning after the library, which meant the Duke had sent for him before he had any reason to believe she would ever stand in that room. "His Grace instructed me a fortnight since to draw the settlements," Penhale said. "They are drawn. There is no engagement to Miss Halstead to break since none was ever executed, and a toast is not a contract. I did mention this, my lady, at the time. The dowager said you did," and put her hand over her eyes for a moment, and when she took it away she was, Clara thought, simply an old woman who had been wrong in front of her neighbors. "Miss Weston," the dowager said, "sit down. You are standing and everyone is watching, and it does you no service." It was not an apology. It was the nearest thing to one that a woman of 70, who has been raised inside a machine, can produce, inside 4 minutes. Clara sat down. The Duke did not let go of her hand. The rest of that dinner went on. That was the thing nobody warns you about. The game came in and was eaten. Lady Marchbank asked Clara 3 questions about Rothcaster, and listened to the answers. Mr. Carow told a long story about the old Duke and a horse badly, and was laughed at kindly. The orchestra played in the next room to a floor that stayed nearly empty, and at 10:30 Miss Halstead's carriage was called and she went, and she stopped at Clara's chair on her way past and said, quietly, "He looked at nobody for 6 years. I did notice. I simply thought I could outlast it." Then she went out, and her mother went after her, and that was the last Clara ever saw of her. Later, much later, when the carriages had gone and the candles were down to stubs, they sat in the library, and he opened the locket. He had to work at the catch. It had been 8 years in a pocket. Inside there was no portrait. There was a lock of dark hair and a folded scrap of paper the size of a thumbnail. And on the paper, in a hand that was not the Duke's, were the words, "Lisbon, do not tell him." Clara did not touch it. She watched his face, and she watched him understand in the space of about 10 seconds that his brother had been carrying his intended marriage in a locket around his throat when he came home to ask for £300, and had gone away without saying so, and that the money had not been for debts at all. "He never told me," the Duke said. "He did not want you to refuse her," Clara said. "He wanted you to refuse the money. It was easier." He put the paper back. He closed the locket. He sat with it in his palm for a long moment, and then he said, "I gave this away in a road in the rain to a girl with wet feet, because I could not stand to have it against my chest for 1 more hour, and I did not want to be the man who threw it in a ditch." "I know," Clara said. "I have thought about that road every wet March since." "I know," Clara said. "So have I." He looked at her then the way he had looked at her for 3 seconds on the first morning, and this time he did not stop at 3. and he reached out and put his hand along her jaw, and she turned her face into it before she had decided to. And neither of them moved for a long time. He leaned in, he stopped, close enough that she could feel the breath of it. "Clara," he said, "I am not going to be able to undo this," she said. "You understand. Whatever this is, I will not be able to put it back." "No," he said. "Neither will I." He kissed her. It was soft, and it was slow, and it was full of every hour of 8 years of rain, and when it ended, she found she had a handful of his shirt and did not remember taking it. They were married in the parish church at Thornhout on the 3rd of June, with Henry carrying nothing at all because he had been given something to carry and had lost it inside 4 minutes, and the Dowager Lady Ferrars in the second pew in grey silk, who had come, which was the whole of what she had to offer and was accepted as such. Mr. Penhale wept, which nobody had anticipated. Henry was told, in the autumn, and told carefully, and told the truth, and the portrait at the end of the long gallery was turned around, and a boy of 7 stood in front of his father in regimentals for the first time in his life, and said that he had a peculiar mouth, and the Duchess of Ashcombe had to leave the gallery for a moment, and the Duke did not, and stood there, with his hand on his son's shoulder in the dust and the north light, for a very long while. That November, the rain came back the way it always did in that country, 3 days of it off, the fells and no let-up, and Clara stood at the window of the green room, which was the nursery still, and watched it come down over the park. The locket hung at her throat on a plain ribbon. Henry would have it at 1 It had been agreed. Behind her, her husband said, "Come away from the glass. You will take cold." She did not turn around yet. She put her fingers on it and felt the small, worn shape of it that she had known in the dark of her pocket for 8 years. And she thought about a girl standing in a road, with nothing at all, who had been given the only thing a stranger had left to give. Then she came away from the glass,